Hello everyone, welcome back. The GTX 960 4GB in here managed to perform better than what I expected, and if the price of one goes in the 40 USD range or lower, it could still be a good buy. One of the reasons for this is the DirectX feature level support, which is 12.1, like for all second generation Maxwell GPUs. And speaking of said GPU, you can view all of its properties in the GPU Z window seen now on the screen, or on the Tech Power Up website, link in the description. To be noted that unlike most variants of the GTX 960, the MSI Gaming sample we tested has 4GB of GDDR5 memory, twice of the typical amount. The card is rated for a TDP of just 120 watts and uses a single 8-pin power connector. The Maxwell architecture is basically showing us what GCN failed to, just how power efficient the 28nm production node can be. To cool off this card, MSI employed a solution that is quite a bit overkill. Two 95mm fans strapped on a decent fin stack traversed by 3 heat pipes. The power delivery system has its own heatsink that does receive airflow from the mentioned fans. Unfortunately though, the memory chips have to rely on airflow alone for cooling. The metallic backplate does provide extra rigidity to the card, but there are no thermal pads connecting it to the PCB. A bit of a missed opportunity. With the default fan curve, the card will go in the mid-60s in heaven for a 40C delta over ambient. But with the same aggressive curve typically reserved for the R9-90X, the GTX 960 has its temperature drop in the low 50s, with much less noise than the aforementioned AMD card. A video card alone cannot play games, it needs a PC to reside in, and for the GTX 960 we used the same good old Z230 HP workstation sporting the i3-1241v3 Xeon CPU, better known as i7-4770 in the consumer space. As for RAM, the PC uses 32GB of DDR3 running in dual channel at 1600 MHz. We opened the gaming results section with alien isolation. I was able to avoid the xenomorph and power up the secondary systems, and the average of 122 FPS was much more than what is needed for the single player title. Since the game was tested at 1080 Ultra settings, the only way to transform the excess of performance into visual goodness is by increasing the resolution. For Apex Legends, however, you will want both high frame rate and high resolution. At 1080 and lower settings, the GTX 960 averaged 106 FPS. This number improved as the resolution dropped, reaching almost 140 FPS at 720. Now, the 1% lows stayed at above 70% of the average at all tested resolutions, so the frame delivery is good. I'd play the game at 1080, if you want my opinion. I found out the hard way that Resident Evil 4 requires a DirectX feature level of minimum 11.1. The GTX 960 4GB, with its support for 12.1 feature level, has no problem running the game at its lowest settings, and averaged 41 FPS at 1080 and 63 FPS at 720 resolution. The 1% lows were in the high 20s and mid 30s respectively. Being a single player title, one can get away with both lower FPS and lower pixel count. Still, I'd give 1080 a shot before dropping the resolution. The multiplayer aspect of Battlefield 5 is similar to the previously mentioned Apex Legends, in requiring both high FPS and high resolution to be able to discern targets that are far. The GTX 960 can satisfy the 1% above 60 FPS requirement only at 720 resolution. Still, I'd give the higher resolutions a shot, since their averages are not at all bad. Just like with all video cards in the same performance bracket, I'd play Control at 1080 resolution and low settings, since the GTX 960 is capable of delivering 57 FPS on average and almost 50 FPS for the 1% lows. The game feels quite smooth. 720 resolution is also an option, but you shouldn't really need it. Full HD runs just fine. Rainbow Six Siege has no problems running on the GTX 960 at the lower settings. The card averaged anywhere between 122 FPS at 1080 resolution and 100% render scale, and 214 FPS at 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The 1% lows stayed in the 70 to 80% of the average, for a very good frame delivery. The now 10 years old GTA 5 does not represent that much of a challenge for the GTX 960. At 1080 resolution and lowest possible settings, the card averaged 126 FPS, with the 1% lows in the mid-70s. Happy Michaeling, Trevoring, Franklining, I guess. CS2 is the fourth multiplayer title in our suite, so yes, we do want lots of FPS at a higher resolution if possible. The GTX 960 is able to provide averages ranging between 113 FPS at 1080 resolution and low settings and 146 at 720 resolution. In all cases, I played a bot match in Dust 2 and the resolution scale was set to 100%. The 1% lows, however, were not as smooth as with Apex, for example, at low 60s at 1080 resolution and increasing to mid 80s at 720. If you've seen me playing against bots in CS2, you'll quickly understand why I use a match replay to benchmark Dota 2. The GTX 960 averaged 88 FPS and provided 1% lows in the mid 50s, quite adequate for this type of game. Fortnite managed to remain relevant, and one factor for this is its performance mode. This DirectX 11 simple renderer allows slower video cards to play the game at respectable frame rates, and in the case of GTX 960, this ranged from 125 FPS at 1080 resolution to 144 at 720. The 1% lows were surprisingly good at 70 and 80 FPS respectively. It's no surprise that Overwatch 2 runs well on the GTX 960. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, the card averaged just shy of 200 FPS, and the 1% lows stayed at about 75% of the average for a very good game experience. Frame rates improve when dropping the resolution, as seen on screen right now, but Full HD will do just fine, just like for the next game. Rocket League was tested at only 1080 resolution and low settings. The average the GTX 960 got of 243 FPS does not require dropping the resolution. And if the average number is not enough to drive that point across, then keep in mind that the 1% low stayed above 100 FPS. Despite providing statistics for both 1080 and 720 resolutions, Splitgate can and should be played in Full HD, since the GTX 960 averaged 168 FPS. As for the 1% lows, I suspect some issues were the one that I had, and the 720 resolution numbers show a much higher value for it. Typically, Valorant behaves as CPU bound, even with lower performance cards, see our previous review of the GT 1030. However, for some odd reason, the GTX 960 averaged only 190 FPS and had 1% lows in the mid-80s. Can't really tell what happened there. I did not notice any weird CPU usage during the run. Next up is the HiRez Studio trio, Paladins, Royale and Rogue Company. All three of them were ran at 1080 resolution and provided the following results. Paladins ran at 129 FPS on average with 80 FPS for the 1% lows at mostly high settings. Royale 145 FPS on average and 51 FPS for the 1% lows, also at higher settings. And Rogue Company, my favorite of the bunch, 143 FPS on average with 1% loss of 86 FPS at low settings. At this performance level, World of Tanks Blitz serves only as a test for the monitor's refresh rate. The FPS is capped by the game, and I failed to see a VSync option to toggle off. As a result, at 1080 resolution and low settings, the GTX 960 averaged 60 FPS and provided 56 FPS for the 1% lows. Did I mention that I didn't get the tank blown up this time around? After double checking that I was running under the classic rendering engine at 1080 resolution and low settings, I fired up the Mariana mission in Warframe, and the GTX 960 averaged 330 FPS. The 1% lows were close to 200, so no complaints about how the game felt. After reviewing this card, I realized that my local used parts market has problems. The 2GB variant of the card would routinely sell for 30 USD, less than the 40 USD asking price for the cheapest working R9 to 80. And the cheapest 4GB variant of the 960 would go for about the same 40 USD. Under these conditions, I'd go for the 4GB GTX 960 any day of the week. And the lower price point of the 2GB variant, coupled with the lower TDP and better DirectX feature level support, make the 960 the more appealing card overall. Anyway, this is not the last we'll hear of the GTX 960. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the future videos that will feature this card. As for this one, well, we're done. I hope you liked it.